There are moments in life when you haven't done anything wrong, yet you're still asked to leave your seat. Imagine this. You've worked your whole life to be in a place you deserve. You board a plane, sit in first class, not by luck but because you've paid the price with your efforts. Then someone approaches and gently asks you, "Are you sure you belong here?" No raising your voice, no direct insults, just a very small suspicion, but enough to make you stand up. If it were you, would you remain silent and let things blow over, or would you stand firm, even knowing that the price to pay could be very high? This story isn't just about a black female CEO being escorted out of first class. It's about the times we're suspected simply because we don't look like what others imagine. And it's about a question that's hard to answer. When treated unfairly, should we leave or stay to change something? If you've ever felt like you had to work twice as hard just to be treated fairly, stay tuned for this story. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join me on a journey that is very real, very human, and perhaps very similar to your own. The first-class cabin was so quiet that morning that I could almost hear my own heartbeat. A North Atlantic Airways wide-body Boeing is parked at Gate 12 of JFK Airport. Outside the window, refueling vehicles move slowly along the dew-covered runway. The early New York sunlight streams through the thick glass, reflecting off the neatly arranged rows of cream-colored leather seats. The scent of hot coffee mingled with the aroma of new leather, creating a familiar feeling, the feeling of long flights for those accustomed to traveling. Naomi Carter entered the first-class cabin at a slow, unhurried pace. She wore a simple navy blue blazer over an ivory silk blouse and well-fitting dark trousers. There was no elaborate jewelry, just a round watch with a worn brown leather strap. Her hair was neatly tied back, tidy but not trying to impress. She looked like an ordinary office worker on a business trip, nothing more. Naomi found seat 1A, put down her bag, sat down and let out a sigh of relief. It had been a long week. Meetings followed one another. Numbers never seemed to stand still. Decisions where a single signature could change the fate of thousands. This flight wasn't a luxury for her, but simply a rare moment of calm before she had to continue. She opened her tablet, scrolled through a few unread emails, then stopped. Naomi knew she needed a break. She turned off the screen, leaned back in her chair, and closed her eyes for a few seconds. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice rang out right beside her, close enough for Naomi to open her eyes. "That's Linda Whitmore." Linda was the chief flight attendant for first class. She was in her 50s with neatly styled blonde hair and a professional smile that seemed honed through years of service. A dark blue silk scarf was perfectly tied around her neck, and her uniform was impeccably neat, without a single wrinkle. Naomi looked up at her, smiling softly. Yes, Linda looked down at the tablet in her hand, then back at Naomi. Her gaze lingered longer than necessary. It wasn't a typical curious look, but rather a silent assessment, as if trying to put something into place in her mind. "Can I see your boarding pass again, please?" Naomi was slightly surprised, but didn't show it. She pulled out her phone, opened her e-boarding pass, and showed it. "Here you go." Linda took it, glanced quickly at the screen, and then didn't return it immediately. She looked up, glancing at Naomi once more, observing her face, her hair, and the simple clothes she was wearing. Her gaze wasn't rude, but it wasn't friendly either. It carried an unspoken question. Naomi was used to that look. From the time she was a black college student walking into white-dominated meeting rooms, from presentations where she was asked questions they'd never asked of her colleagues, from fancy restaurants where waiters constantly looked around for the real payer. She was used to it. But being used to it didn't mean she didn't feel anything. "Is there a problem?" Naomi asked, her voice calm. Linda smiled, a faint smile. "Oh, nothing serious. Just a quick verification." She glanced toward the back of the cabin where the other passengers were seated. Most were middle-aged men in smart suits. Some had already ordered wine despite it being only morning. They seemed to pay little attention to this small exchange. Or if they did, they pretended not to notice. Linda returned the phone to Naomi. "Thank you. We just want to make sure everyone is seated correctly." Naomi nodded. "I get it." Linda turned and walked a few steps, then stopped. She turned back, her voice slightly different this time. It was no longer entirely gentle. "Ma'am, may I ask, are you a member of our global executive program?" The question was posed very naturally, as if it were something obvious that needed confirmation. Naomi looked directly at her. "I bought this ticket at full price." Linda tilted her head slightly. a hint of bewilderment flashing in her eyes. "Because this seat," she said slowly, "is typically reserved for our most exclusive travelers." A very brief silence fell between them. Just a few seconds, but enough for Naomi to clearly sense the change in the atmosphere. She took a deep breath. "And I am one of them." Her voice was neither high nor low nor challenging. It was just an ordinary statement, a calm presentation of the truth. Linda was silent for a moment. The smile on her lips stiffened, then was replaced by a more neutral expression. "Of course," she said. "I just need to double-check something." Linda walked away, leaving Naomi sitting there, a familiar feeling rising in her chest. Not an outburst of anger, but a lingering weariness. Naomi looked out the window. A ground staff member was gesturing to the flight crew. The plane was about to close its doors. She wondered, not for the first time, why moments like these kept happening even though she was so far away. No one on this plane knew who she was, and that in a strange way made everything even more exposed. Naomi doesn't need special treatment because of her title or power. She just wants to be treated fairly like any other passenger who paid for this seat. Little did she know that in just a few minutes, this flight would no longer be an ordinary flight, and this quiet confrontation which had just begun would have consequences that no one in first class, including Linda Whitmore, could have foreseen. The plane vibrated slightly as the cabin door prepared to close. Naomi closed her eyes once more. She didn't know what she was about to face, but there was one thing she knew very well. She had been through too much in life to be swept off her feet by a single glance. Linda Whitmore didn't return immediately. Naomi Carter realized it before she could consciously name the feeling in her heart. Usually after checking tickets, the flight attendant would return with a polite smile or at least a brief closing remark. But not this time. Linda disappeared toward the front of the cabin, where the cockpit entrance was obscured by a thick gray curtain. The first-class cabin continued its familiar rhythm of an impending flight. A younger flight attendant carried a hot towel down the aisle. A man in seat 1C requested more mineral water. An elderly couple in the row behind them were talking about their Napa Valley vacation. Everything looks perfectly normal. But Naomi didn't. She sat up a little straighter, not out of anxiety but because of a reflex honed over the years. When her surroundings suddenly changed without explanation, her body was always the first to react. Naomi looked down at her hands. They rested neatly on her lap, fingers lightly intertwined. Not trembling, not tense, but somewhere deep inside a familiar voice whispered, "Here we go again." She remembers very clearly the first time she heard that voice. That year, Naomi, 24 years old, and a recent MBA graduate walked into her first meeting as the youngest project manager in the room. A middle-aged man asked her right in front of everyone if she was sure she was in the right meeting room. He said it jokingly, but his eyes were anything but. Naomi laughed. She always laughed in situations like this. Not because she was happy, but because she understood the price of not laughing. She looked around the compartment. In seat 1B, a white man in his 50s was flipping through the Wall Street Journal. His watch gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the window. Naomi noticed that the flight attendant had just called him by his first name, very naturally, very familiarly. At seat 2A, a brunette woman is ordering a cappuccino. She doesn't need to explain anything. No one asks her if she's part of any membership program. Naomi wasn't jealous. She'd gotten over that feeling a long time ago. But she was acutely aware of the difference in how people perceived her. The sound of light footsteps echoed from behind. Linda Whitmore returned, this time not alone. Beside her was a young male flight attendant, his face tense, holding another tablet. Linda stopped next to seat 1A. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice still polite but somehow colder than before. Naomi looked up. "Yes. Would you mind confirming your destination for me?" Naomi blinked. This question had nothing to do with the chair. "San Francisco," she replied. Linda nodded and turned to the young flight attendant. "And your boarding group," Naomi sensed some eyes beginning to turn in her direction. It wasn't very obvious, but enough to create an invisible pressure. "Group 1, Naomi said. Linda let out a soft sigh as if trying to remain calm. "I see. It's just that," she hesitated. "We've had a few issues this morning with seat assignments." Naomi looked directly at her. "I've been sitting here since I boarded the plane." "Of course," Linda replied quickly. "But sometimes there are system errors." Naomi felt a slight warmth rising in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "If there's a system error, I'm willing to wait for it to be resolved. but I don't understand why only my seat needs to be verified so many times. The air around us seemed to freeze. Linda's lips curved slightly, a very small movement, but Naomi saw it. It wasn't a smile. It was the reflex of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. "Ma'am," Linda said more slowly, "I'm just doing my job." That phrase, Naomi had heard it countless times. "I'm just doing my job." This phrase is used to cover up everything from unconscious prejudice to systemic injustice. Naomi nodded. "I understand, and I'm just sitting in the seat I paid for." A silence lasted a few seconds. Linda looked at Naomi, then glanced around the cabin. She could feel the gazes of the other passengers, and perhaps even the crew behind her. Finally, Linda said, "Please remain seated. I need to check something with the gate." Naomi didn't answer. She just nodded slightly. Linda turned away. This time she didn't walk quickly. Each step seemed heavier, as if she were carrying a decision that she wasn't entirely sure about. Naomi leaned back in her chair, a feeling of exhaustion spreading through her. She wasn't afraid of being asked to disembark. She'd faced worse than that. But what weighed heavily on her was this familiar feeling, the feeling of having to prove her legitimate existence in a space where she should have been welcomed like anyone else. She thought of her mother. The woman who had been a nurse for 30 years, always dressed impeccably whenever she went to something important, because she believed that if she were a little more presentable, the world would treat her a little more fairly. Naomi's mother once said, "You mustn't make the same mistakes as others, because they won't give you a chance to correct them." Naomi lived by those words for half her life. A voice boomed over the internal loudspeaker system, announcing that the flight would be delayed by a few minutes. No specific reason was given. Naomi knew that in many cases delays weren't technical problems. They were human hesitation. She looked at her watch. The second hand was still moving steadily. A part of her wondered, what if I got up and left right now? Not because she was wrong, but because she didn't want to face this anymore. But then she thought of something else. If she stood up and left, the story would end there. No one would learn anything. No one would have to face those uncomfortable questions. Naomi took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. She decided to stay. Not to prove myself right, but to see where this system will go when challenged by calmness. At the front of the cabin, Linda Whitmore was standing and talking to someone on the phone. Her face was serious. Her hands gripped the tablet so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Naomi saw that scene, and a very clear premonition arose in her heart. This won't stop at just polite questions, and this flight sooner or later will become a place that no one in first class will ever forget. Linda Whitmore returned even faster than the last time. Gone was the leisurely gait of a chief flight attendant accustomed to overseeing everything in first class. Her heels tapped the aircraft floor with a steady but firm rhythm, as if each step had been predetermined. Naomi Carter noticed that change immediately. It wasn't from her face. Linda maintained her professional neutral expression. It was from her shoulders. They were slightly tense, like someone who had just convinced themselves to do something they were still hesitant about deep down. This time, Linda wasn't going alone. Following her were 2 airport security officers. They wore dark uniforms, had sturdy builds, and serious but not aggressive expressions. They stood at a comfortable distance from seat 1, not too close to be frightening, but not too far to suggest they were merely observers. The first-class cabin suddenly fell silent. The clinking of spoons against glasses stopped. The hushed conversation in the back ceased. A few passengers looked up instinctively, sensing that something was wrong. Linda stopped next to Naomi. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice lowering, "I need you to step off the aircraft with us." The words fell into the quiet space like a heavy object. Naomi didn't stand up immediately. She looked up at Linda, then glanced quickly at the 2 security guards. Their eyes held neither hostility nor sympathy. "For what reason?" Naomi asked. Linda clenched her jaw slightly. "There appears to be an issue with your seat assignment. We'll resolve it at the gate." Naomi kept her voice steady. "I already asked. My ticket is valid. I'm not causing any trouble. I don't understand why I need to leave the plane." Linda tilted her head, lowering her voice, but it was still loud enough for those around her to hear. "Ma'am, please cooperate. You're delaying the flight." A familiar keyword, delaying the flight. Naomi felt a wave of hot and cold sensations run down her spine, not from fear, but from the injustice of how things were being framed. She looked around the compartment. A man in seat 1B avoided her gaze, bending down to adjust his cuff. A woman behind him tilted her head slightly as if trying to hear better. A phone was raised and lowered, hesitating between filming and pretending not to see. Naomi stood up. It wasn't because she was forced. It was because she didn't want to be dragged along in a sitting position. "I'll go," she said. "But I want to make one thing clear." Linda looked at her, her eyes wary. "I am being asked to leave my paid-for seat without any valid reason. And this is happening in front of everyone." Linda pursed her lips. "That's not necessary, Miss Carter." "For me, yes," Naomi replied. She bent down, picked up the coat from the chair, and carefully folded it. Her slow movements only increased the tension in the room. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't want anyone to say she was agitated or aggressive. 2 security guards stepped forward. "Ma'am, please," someone said, their voice low but firm. Naomi turned to him. "I am cooperating." She stepped out into the hallway. At that moment, the first-class cabin held its breath. Naomi walked slowly towards the airplane door. Each step was a silent dialogue with herself. What did I do wrong? Nothing. Is there anything else I could have done? Probably nothing. As she walked past the remaining seats, she could clearly feel the gazes fixed on her back. Not all of them were malicious. Some gazes were confused, some were curious, and some were completely indifferent. That, in a way, hurts even more. At the airplane door, cold air from the jet bridge blew in. Naomi paused for a second, turning her head. She looked at Linda Whitmore. "I hope it's worth it," Naomi said, her voice so calm it was almost devoid of emotion. Linda didn't answer. The airplane door closed behind Naomi with a soft click, but in her head the sound echoed loudly. The jet bridge was empty. Footsteps echoed. No more the soft lighting of first class, no more the smell of coffee, no more the carefully designed comfort. Only Naomi, 2 security guards, and the cold space between the plane and the terminal remained. One of the 2 security guards spoke up. "Ma'am, we'll take you back to the gate desk. This shouldn't take long." Naomi nodded. She didn't say she'd heard that phrase too many times in her life. As they entered the terminal, the familiar noise of the airport assaulted them. Announcements blared from the loudspeakers, the sound of suitcase wheels rolling on the floor, the incessant murmur of people talking. Naomi stood by the counter waiting. Linda Whitmore did not follow them out. She returned to the plane. Naomi looked down at her hands. They were still steady, but inside a different dialogue was taking place. Have I become too accustomed to enduring things? Is this calmness sometimes a form of compromise? She thought of all the times she had chosen to remain silent, believing that protesting would only make things worse. She thought of the meetings where her opinions were ignored until someone else repeated them exactly. She thought of the emails she had to double-check just to avoid being misinterpreted as too harsh. Naomi didn't cry. She had never cried in moments like this. Not because she didn't feel pain, but because she had learned to keep her pain deep inside. A staff member at the counter looked up, giving Naomi a scrutinizing glance. "Ma'am, what seems to be the issue?" Naomi opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. She suddenly realized that no matter what she said, the story had already been told in someone else's way. She took a deep breath. "I was asked to leave the plane," she said, "and I'm waiting for an explanation." The employee typed a few lines on the computer, frowning. "Your ticket is valid," he said. "Seat 1A, full fare." Naomi looked at him. "I know." The employee looked up, a hint of surprise in his eyes. He glanced at the 2 security guards, then turned back to the screen. "I'll need to make a call," he said. Naomi nodded. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if the flight would wait for her. She didn't know what Linda Whitmore was saying to the crew on the other side of the door. But one thing was very clear in her mind right now. If this story ended here, it would only be another sad memory on an already long list. And Naomi Carter was tired of carrying those kinds of memories. The airplane door closed behind Naomi Carter, and in that moment the world seemed to change its tone. No more the low, steady hum of the engines emanating from the aircraft. No more the soft lighting designed to make people forget the passage of time. No more polite greetings or professional smiles. Only a long, narrow, cold gray metal expanse of the jet bridge remains. The jet bridge always has a very distinctive smell. The smell of iron and steel, of the cold air, from the powerful air conditioning, of the hurried footsteps that have passed through and then disappeared. It's not a place for anyone to stay long. It's just a transition point. A place that doesn't belong anywhere. Naomi slowed her pace. 2 security officers walked behind her, maintaining just enough distance so as not to make her feel escorted, but also not to forget that she was no longer completely free. They said nothing. Their silence was professional, non-judgmental, emotionless. Naomi liked that. She preferred silence to empty explanations. Each step echoed dryly on the metal floor. The sound reminded Naomi of the long corridors in old office buildings where she used to walk with a feeling of having to prove something even when no one directly asked her to. She stopped near the middle of the tubular bridge. One of the two security guards spoke softly. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Naomi turned her head. The fluorescent lights made the man's face appear pale, but his eyes were not cold. "I'm fine," she said, and this time she meant it. She didn't feel panicked. She didn't feel afraid. The only thing weighing on her at this moment was a familiar feeling, very old, very deep. It feels like being on the edge between speaking up and remaining silent. Naomi leaned lightly on the metal railing of the tubular bridge. Outside, through the small windows, she could see part of the runway. Other planes were taking off, taxiing and departing in a line. Each one carried people, stories, and destinations. And you stay here. She reflected on the journey that had brought her to where she was today. It's not a fairy tale. There's no sudden stroke of luck. Just years of working in rooms where she was always the only one who looked different. Many times, she had to listen more than she spoke. Many decisions were made in silence, then carried out with stubborn persistence. Naomi learned one thing very early on. When you are a black woman in a power space, you are not allowed to react with your true emotions. You have to react as a more socially acceptable version of yourself. Stay calm, be composed, be professional. She did it so well, perhaps so well that sometimes she wondered if she was shrinking herself. A memory surfaced so vivid that Naomi had to close her eyes. The day she received the CEO title for the first time. Not in a formal ceremony, but in a small meeting room when the board of directors announced the decision in an almost apologetic tone. One of them said, "We believe you're the right choice, given the circumstances." Given the circumstances, Naomi didn't ask any further questions. She nodded. She accepted responsibility. She worked twice as hard so that no one could say it was a wrong decision. She opened her eyes. Jet Bridge is still there, cold, neutral, taking no sides. Naomi realized she wasn't as angry with Linda Whitmore as people might think. What hurt her more was the ease with which everything had happened. Just a few questions, a few glances, and a decision was made without clear evidence. She had seen it happen to others before, young employees, potential partners, people who seemed out of place. And today, it's her turn. "Ma'am," the other security guard said, his voice softer, "we'll be heading back to the gate in just a moment." Naomi nodded. She didn't ask what they thought. She didn't need to know. Instead, she asked herself a different, much more difficult question. If I had spoken up more forcefully from the beginning, would things have turned out differently, or would it have only confirmed their preconceived notions? Naomi knew there were no simple answers. She chose the path of composure because it allowed her to survive and thrive in a system not built for people like her. But sometimes that composure also becomes an excuse for the system to continue operating without change. She recalled a conversation she had with her father many years ago. He once said, "You are not responsible for fixing the world for everyone, but you have the right to decide what you will accept." Naomi stood up straighter. She didn't know if this flight would wait for her. She didn't know what was being said behind that airplane door. But she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer willing to let things like this just pass and disappear. A soft sound echoed from behind. The airplane door opened a tiny crack, then closed again. Naomi didn't look back. But in that moment, she sensed a very subtle shift in the air. It was as if a gear in the machine had just stopped moving. She took a deep breath. If this is the time to stand firm, she will stand firm. Not by shouting or resisting, but by not retreating any further. Jet bridges aren't places for big decisions, but sometimes it's these intermediate places that reveal most clearly who you are and what you won't accept. Naomi Carter looked straight ahead. And for the first time since boarding the plane, she wasn't just waiting to see what would happen, she was ready to face it. The cockpit of the Boeing is quiet in a very different way. There was no first-class luxury, no aroma of coffee or polite conversation. Just the soft light from the control panel, the rhythmic beeping of systems in standby mode, and two people sitting opposite each other, each bearing the heavy responsibility of tens of thousands of pounds of metal and hundreds of lives on their shoulders. Captain Michael Reynolds removed his headphones and set them aside. He had been flying for over 30 years, from short domestic flights to long transatlantic voyages of over 10 hours. He had dealt with bad weather, technical malfunctions, and even difficult passengers, but there was one thing he always believed in. Airplanes can be repaired. Humans are not that simple. "What's the matter?" he asked, his voice low, not loud but firm. The co-pilot Daniel Price turned to look at him. Daniel was young, just over 30, his eyes still retaining the caution of someone unfamiliar with making big decisions in the gray zone. Linda Whitmore called Daniel, said, "She reported that a passenger in first class couldn't verify their seat 1A. Security has removed them." Captain Reynolds frowned. "Unverified," Daniel nodded. "She said there was a possible system error, and the passengers weren't cooperating." That remark made Reynolds stop. He turned his chair, staring straight at the dashboard, but his mind was elsewhere. "Not cooperative," he repeated. "In what sense?" Daniel shrugged. She didn't elaborate. She just said it needed to be dealt with before closing. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. He reached for the tablet mounted on the side of the pilot's seat and opened the passenger list. He didn't do this because he suspected Linda Whitmore. He had flown with her for years and knew she was meticulous, sometimes rigid. But he also knew something else. The problems that frequently arise in first class are rarely accidental. He pulled the list down to seat 1A. The name that appeared on the screen made him freeze. Naomi Carter. Reynolds squinted and read it again. Naomi Carter. He had seen this name before. Not on the passenger list, but in high-level internal emails. In those bulletins that pilots usually don't pay close attention to but still glance over. He tapped on the name, opening the details. First-class ticket, full fare. No upgrade required. Not an award ticket. Not a special offer. Reynolds felt a chill run down his spine. "Daniel," he said, his voice lower. "Do you remember last week's email?" Daniel turned around. "Which email address? Captain announcement regarding changes in shareholder structure." Daniel thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yes. It seems to be about an acquisition, but I didn't read it carefully." Reynolds took a slow breath. He opened his internal email application and searched for an old message. His finger paused on a subject line. "North Atlantic Airways. Ownership update." He opened the letter. The name is clearly visible. Naomi Carter. He was not an ordinary passenger. He holds a controlling stake through a private equity fund. He just signed the deal to acquire a majority stake in the company a few days ago. The information hasn't been widely publicized, but it's enough for those at the highest levels to know. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, feeling as if someone had just slammed on the brakes in his head. "Daniel," he said slowly, "who did we just let off the plane?" Daniel bent down to look at the screen. His eyes widened. "Oh, just one word. But that's enough." The cockpit was silent. It wasn't the silence of the equipment, but the silence of two people who had just realized they were facing a situation for which no checklist taught how to handle it. "Does Linda know?" Daniel asked. Reynolds shook his head. "I don't think so." He glanced at the passenger list again. Seat 1A was empty. A very small space, but one that carried an immense weight. "We can't take off," Reynolds said. Daniel turned around. "Captain, if the person who was just escorted down was Naomi Carter," Reynolds continued, "this isn't just about customer service. This is about ethics. And it's about the law." Daniel swallowed hard. "What should we do?" Reynolds closed his eyes for a few seconds. He thought about the years he had spent flying, about the decisions he had made, some right, some that had kept him awake for many nights. He remembered something his father, an old aeronautical mechanic, had once said. "You can follow the correct procedure and still do something wrong." Reynolds opened his eyes. "We're going to hold the plane," he said. "Turn off the engines. No pushback." Daniel looked at him, hesitating slightly. "Linda wouldn't like that." Reynolds turned to look at him. "This isn't about whether Linda likes it or not. It's about right or wrong." He reached out and flipped the switch, sending a signal to the ground. The engine hadn't started. The plane remained in standby mode. Then he pressed the intercom button. "Cabin crew, this is the flight deck," Reynolds said, his voice echoing through the system. "We're holding the aircraft. Do not proceed with departure." A brief silence followed. Captain Linda Whitmore's voice rang out, slightly tense. "May I ask why?" Reynolds kept his voice calm. "We need to resolve an issue regarding seat 1A. Linda was silent for a second. "That passenger was removed," she said. "The issue has been handled." Reynolds looked straight ahead. "No," he replied, "it hasn't." Daniel glanced at him, his eyes filled with both anxiety and respect. He knew that from this moment on, things would never be the same again. Reynolds placed his hand on the controls, but not to fly, rather to keep everything still. On the other side of the cockpit door, the first-class cabin began to stir. A flight being delayed wasn't uncommon, but it was rare because of a seat. Reynolds knew that when he made this decision, he was putting his career at stake. But he also knew that if he didn't, there were things he would never get back: honor, self-respect, and the belief that the heavens remain a place where one can still believe in the most fundamental principles. He looked at the screen again. Naomi Carter's name was still there, and for the first time since the story began, the gears of the system have actually stopped. The plane didn't move. That was the first thing seasoned passengers noticed. Not visually, but with a very familiar sensation in their bodies. When a flight is about to take off, there's always a series of small vibrations, a gentle push, like a gradually increasing heartbeat. But this time there was nothing. Time passes, and everything remains the same. Several passengers began glancing at their watches. The man in seat 1B frowned, folding up his copy of the Wall Street Journal. The woman in seat 2A looked up, gazing toward the cabin door as if waiting for an unseen explanation. At the front, Linda Whitmore stood near the first-class galley. She held her back straight, her hands clasped together, her face maintaining its familiar professional expression. But a closer look revealed a subtle change. Her breathing quickened. Linda disliked waiting. For 25 years as a flight attendant, she had always believed that first class was a place where everything had to run smoothly on schedule and in perfect order. Every minute of delay was a scratch on the image she had worked so hard to build. She walked over to the interphone mounted on the wall and picked it up. "Flight deck, this is Linda," she said, her voice still under control. "Passengers are getting restless. May I ask how long the delay will be?" In the cockpit, Captain Michael Reynolds answered immediately without hesitation. "Linda, the aircraft will remain grounded until further notice. No further explanation needed." Linda gripped the handle tightly. "Captain," she said, trying to keep her voice soft, "the situation has already been addressed. The passenger in question has been offloaded." A moment of silence lasted for a few seconds. Linda Reynolds replied, his voice low but clear, "The situation has not been resolved. Please do not proceed with any reassignment of seat 1A. Linda felt her heart beating faster. She turned her back to the intercom, her gaze sweeping across the first-class cabin. Seat 1A was empty. A stark emptiness, a quiet reminder that something remained unresolved. A passenger stood up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice slightly sharp. "We've been sitting here for 10 minutes. "What's going on?" Linda turned around, flashing a smile she'd practiced 1,000 times. "Thank you for your patience, sir. We're just waiting for a final clearance from the flight deck." Clearance for what the man asked. Linda opened her mouth, then stopped. She couldn't say that the plane was waiting for a passenger who had just been disembarked. Nor could she say that the captain was questioning her decision. "Operational checks," she said succinctly. A few sighs could be heard. A phone was pulled out. Another person whispered to a companion. Linda turned away, feeling something slipping out of her control. She pulled out her personal phone quickly, scrolled through her contacts, and stopped at a name. She hesitated for a moment, then put the phone back in her pocket. Not yet. On the other side of the door, Naomi Carter was standing at the counter near the departure gate. The ground staff member was still on the phone, his voice low but urgent. Naomi couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but she noticed a change in his demeanor. The initial frowns had been replaced by a serious concentration. "Miss Carter," he said at the end of the call. "Could you please wait here for a moment longer?" Naomi nodded. "Is there a problem?" she asked. The employee looked at her, then down at the screen in front of him. "Your ticket is perfectly valid," he said slowly. "There seems to be some internal confusion." Naomi didn't smile. "Usually this kind of confusion doesn't last long enough to delay the entire flight," she said softly. The employee swallowed hard. "Captain has requested that we hold the aircraft," he said, "until you're cleared to reboard." Naomi blinked slightly. This was the first time since stepping off the plane that she felt a real shift. Not in her emotions, but in how the system was reacting. She wasn't quick to celebrate. She had learned that superficial changes often come quickly, but genuine recognition is rare and fragile. She looked towards the large glass windows of the terminal. The North Atlantic Airways plane remained stationary, its long wings outstretched as if waiting. In first class, Linda Whitmore turned on the interphone again. "Captain Reynolds," she said, her voice having lost some of its confidence, "I need clarity." Are we delaying the flight because of one passenger? Reynolds didn't answer immediately. When he did speak, his voice was no longer that of a captain in charge of a flight. Yes, he said, because that passenger should never have been removed. Linda felt the blood rush to her face. Captain, with all due respect, she said, we followed procedure. Reynolds let out a slow sigh. Procedure does not override judgment, he replied. And judgment does not override facts. Linda closed her eyes for a moment. Thoughts began to race through her mind. She thought about the report, about her superiors, about how this could be blown out of proportion if someone filmed it and posted it online. She thought about her image, the image she had protected her entire career. She also considered another more frightening possibility. If I was wrong. Linda opened her eyes. The first-class cabin was no longer quiet. Whispers of questions spread. Some glances began to show suspicion, not directed at Naomi, who was no longer there, but at the very operation of the flight. Linda stood there in the middle of the compartment, realizing something she had avoided for years. Her power exists because people believe she is always right, and that trust once questioned is not easily regained. At the entrance counter, Naomi Carter remained still. She didn't make a phone call. She didn't send an email. She let things unfold naturally. She knew that sometimes timely silence was the way to force the system to confront itself. An announcement blared over the airport's internal loudspeakers. A North Atlantic Airways flight was delayed. No specific reason was given. Naomi gently closed her eyes, then opened them again. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since boarding this flight, she no longer felt like a passive observer awaiting judgment. Somewhere between the cockpit and first class, between procedure and conscience, the flight was truly held back. And it's not just one airplane. Naomi Carter was not called back to the plane with a formal announcement. No formal apology was broadcast over the loudspeaker. No senior staff member rushed towards her with a panicked expression. Just a young ground staff member hurried towards her, walkie-talkie in hand, his breathing somewhat labored. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice lowering reflexively. "The captain has requested that you return to the aircraft." Naomi looked at him for a second, not for confirmation, but for feeling. She didn't ask for the reason, nor did she ask if this return came with an explanation. Those questions at this point were no longer necessary. "Okay," she said. "Just one word." Naomi straightened up, adjusting the blazer on her shoulder. It was a small, ordinary gesture, but for her it was a way to remind herself that she wasn't stepping back into the posture of someone who was allowed, but rather of someone who inherently belonged in that space. The boarding gate opened. The tubular bridge was still as cold as before, but this time Naomi walked with a different pace. Not faster, not slower, just more steady. She could clearly feel the gazes of those around her. Ground staff. A few passengers standing nearby. Some recognized her, some didn't, but everyone sensed that this wasn't an ordinary moment. Naomi entered the airplane cabin. First class is not what it used to be. It wasn't because the interior had changed, but because the atmosphere was different. Conversations stopped when she appeared. A few passengers turned around. Some looked surprised. Others tried to hide their curiosity behind newspapers or phone screens. Linda Whitmore was standing near the galley with her back to the walkway. She turned around when she heard footsteps. The moment their eyes met, Linda felt her heart skip a beat. Naomi didn't look at her with anger. There was no defiant gaze. Just a calm, deep look, as if Naomi were looking directly at the essence of the situation rather than at the person before her. Linda swallowed hard. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice no longer as smooth as before. "Please, come this way." Naomi followed Linda down the aisle of the first-class cabin. She didn't look down. She didn't glance to either side for too long, but she could feel every eye on her. In seat 1B, the man who had previously avoided her gaze now looked up. His eyes betrayed his confusion. In seat 2A, the brunette woman set down her coffee cup, looking at Naomi as if trying to piece together the information in her head. Naomi stopped in front of seat 1A. The chair is still empty. No one dared to sit there. Linda stood beside him, clutching a thin file in her hand. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice softer. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding." Naomi glanced at her chair for a moment, then turned to Linda. "It was a misunderstanding," she repeated, her voice not sarcastic but simply confirming. Linda nodded quickly. "Yes, and Captain Reynolds has requested that we resume boarding procedures immediately." Naomi didn't sit down right away. She looked around the compartment once more. not to seek support, but to take in. She took in the silence. She took in the tension. She took in the fact that everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. She turned to Linda. "I'll sit down," Naomi said. "But before that, I want to know something." Linda was a little stiff. "Yes. Why was I asked to leave the plane?" Linda opened her mouth, then closed it again. In that moment, any prepared answer became meaningless. "Because we needed to verify." "No," Naomi interrupted very softly. "I'm not asking about the process. I'm asking about the reason." A long silence followed. The first-class cabin was so quiet you could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioner blowing from the ceiling. Linda felt pressure from all sides, from the passengers, from the cockpit, and from Naomi Carter's unwavering gaze. Finally, she said, "Because I believed you might not belong in that seat." The words fell into the first-class compartment like a heavy object. Naomi's expression remained unchanged. But somewhere deep inside, she felt a familiar cut that she could name. "Thank you for being honest," Naomi said. She set her bag down and sat in seat 1A. Her movements were slow and steady. As her back leaned against the seat, a very different feeling spread through her. Not victory, but homecoming. Linda stood there, not knowing what to say next. Naomi fastened her seatbelt, then looked up. "Linda," she said, calling her by her first name. "I don't need special treatment. I just need to be treated properly." Linda bowed her head very slightly. "Yes, ma'am." In the cockpit, Captain Michael Reynolds looked at the internal camera screen. He saw Naomi had returned to her seat. He let out a slow sigh. "Cabin crew," he said over the intercom, "prepare for departure checks." His voice echoed throughout the cabin. The plane began to vibrate very slightly. Not the vibrations of takeoff, but the vibrations of a system that had just been repositioned. Naomi looked out the window. The runway was still there. The other planes were continuing their journeys. She sensed something was changing, not just on this flight, but in the way people perceived her presence. But Naomi knew the story wasn't over yet. This return is just the first step, and what comes next will require more than just a chair being returned. The first-class cabin was enveloped in an eerie silence. It wasn't the relaxed silence of passengers already settled in their seats. Rather, it was the silence of people aware that they had just witnessed something beyond the realm of ordinary flights. Naomi Carter sat in seat 1, her back gently leaning against the leather seat, her hands neatly placed on her lap. Her face was calm, but inside layers of emotions were piling up, not gloating, nor anger, rather a heavy, hard-to-describe feeling. She's back. But the price of returning is not small. Linda Whitmore remained standing in the aisle at the front of the cabin. She hadn't left, nor had she resumed her usual routine. It was as if the entire first-class cabin was waiting for her to do something that no one had said. Linda sensed it. She glanced toward the cockpit, then looked down at the intercom mounted on the wall. It was a familiar device usually used only for announcing meal times, reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts or wishing them a pleasant flight. But now, it looked completely different. Heavier, colder, a click sound echoed in her headphones. Linda, Captain Michael Reynolds' voice boomed through the intercom. Not loud, not harsh, but it left no room for evasion. "We need to address what just happened, publicly." Linda closed her eyes for a second. She had flown thousands of flights. She had handled countless unpleasant situations, but she had never been asked to do this. Never had she had to admit her mistake in front of the entire first-class cabin. "Captain," she said, her voice softer, "may I suggest we handle this after landing?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. When he did speak, every word was clear. "No, this happened here. It will be addressed here." Linda opened her eyes. The first-class cabin remained silent, but that silence now carried a sense of tension. Some passengers looked at Linda, some looked at Naomi. No one spoke, but everyone was waiting. Linda took a deep breath. She picked up the intercom. Her hand trembled slightly. No one noticed except herself. She brought the microphone close to her mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Linda began. Her voice echoed throughout the plane, reaching even the business class section behind her. "May I have your attention, please?" Naomi looked up. In that moment, she felt one thing clearly. It wasn't about victory. It was about the fragility of humanity when confronted with oneself. Linda swallowed hard. "A few moments ago," she continued, "a passenger was asked to leave this aircraft under my direction. A few passengers subtly shifted their seating positions. I made that decision," Linda said, her voice slowing based on an assumption. The air in the cabin seemed to become incredibly thick. I assumed she continued that, miss. Naomi Carter did not belong in seat 1A. A very gentle wave swept through the first-class cabin. Not noise, but awareness. Naomi felt her heart tighten for a moment, not because her name was called, but because the truth had just been spoken aloud. Linda inhaled, then exhaled. That assumption was wrong. She paused, a pause long enough that no one could miss it. I was wrong. Naomi closed her eyes for a very brief moment. She never thought she would feel this way. She had imagined this moment countless times in her life, a public apology, an admission. But when it actually happened, the emotions were anything but simple. Linda continued, her voice no longer smooth. I treated Miss Carter unfairly. I questioned her right to be here based on her appearance, not on facts. Several people in the compartment bowed their heads. One man took off his glasses and slowly wiped the lenses, even though they weren't dirty. I'm sorry, Linda said, to Miss Carter, and to all of you, for the delay, and for failing to maintain the standard of respect that this airline claims to stand for. She lowered the microphone. The first-class cabin was eerily silent. There was no applause, no murmurs, just a heavy silence as if everyone was simultaneously processing what they had just heard. Naomi opened her eyes. She looked at Linda, not with triumph, nor with immediate forgiveness. Just a very human, very tired, very real look. She stood up. Nobody expected that. Naomi walked out into the hallway. Not fast, not slow. Each step was steady. She stood next to Linda. I want to say something, Naomi said. Her voice wasn't loud, but the microphone was still on. Everyone in first class held their breath. I'm not standing here to receive an apology, Naomi said. I'm standing here because things like this don't just happen to me. She paused and looked around the compartment. Many of us have been doubted, judged, and questioned simply because we don't fit the preconceived notions of others. She turned to Linda. Her apology is necessary, Naomi said. But what's even more important is change, so that this doesn't happen again to others. Linda bowed her head. Yes, ma'am, she said in a very soft voice. Naomi handed the microphone back. She said nothing more. She returned to seat 1A and sat down. This time, as she leaned back in her chair, the feeling was completely different. It wasn't simply a homecoming. It was an affirmation. Captain Reynolds spoke through the system. Thank you for your patience, he said. We will be departing shortly. The engine started. A slight vibration spread throughout the aircraft. The first-class cabin gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but none of them were the same as before. Naomi looked out the window. The runway began to slide backward as the plane moved. She knew this moment wouldn't end everything. An apology, however, public couldn't erase an entire system. But it is a crack, and sometimes all it takes is a crack big enough for the light to find its way in. The plane has taken off. The moment the landing gear lifted off the runway, a familiar weightless sensation spread through the cabin. The engine noise gradually became steady and stable. The seatbelt signs remained illuminated, but the previous tension seemed to dissipate, giving way to the familiar rhythm of a long-haul flight. Naomi Carter leaned her head back against the seat, gazing out the window. New York City loomed smaller below its buildings, gradually transforming into silent geometric shapes. Above, the sky was clear and still, as if what had just happened below had never existed. She took a slow breath. Rationally, everything was settled. She was back in her seat. A public apology had been given. The plane had taken off. The story, as many had expected, should have ended there. But Naomi didn't feel relieved. It wasn't because she was still angry. Rather, it was a feeling difficult to name, an intuition honed over years of living in environments where safety was often only temporary. Something was missing, she thought. She glanced toward the front of the cabin. Linda Whitmore was walking down the aisle, beginning to serve drinks as if everything were back to normal. She worked with intense concentration, each movement precise, each word concise and accurate. But Naomi realized one thing. Linda avoided her gaze. It's not respect. It's avoidance. As she approached seat 1, Linda stopped, maintaining a safe distance. Miss Carter, she said, her voice lower than usual. May I offer you something to drink? Naomi looked up. The water is fine, she replied. Linda nodded, turned away immediately without another word of pleasantries. The glass of water was placed on the table a few minutes later without a single superfluous remark. Naomi thanked her. Linda didn't reply, just nodded slightly and left. At that moment, Naomi sensed a subtle disharmony. Not enough to call it tension, but enough to be noticeable. She looked around the compartment. Some passengers had begun to relax. One opened their laptop. Another put on headphones and reclined their seat. Life in the air was gradually returning to its familiar routine, but Naomi noticed another detail. In the back seat near the aisle sat a man in a gray hoodie with the hood pulled low. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't reading. He wasn't watching a movie. He just sat there very still, his eyes occasionally glancing over the first-class cabin. His gaze wasn't curious like others. It was focused. It was purposeful. Naomi wasn't staring. She was simply taking notes. Experience taught her that in situations like this, danger rarely comes from the noisiest place. She took a sip of water. Her hand was steady, not shaking. But in her mind, the pieces began to sort themselves out. Linda had apologized publicly, she thought, but she hadn't accepted her mistake in the deepest sense. Naomi had seen this kind of reaction before. Not regret, but shame. And there's a huge difference between the two. Remorse leads to change. Shame, if left untreated, often leads to resistance. She recalled past company restructurings. Managers were questioned. People were forced to admit mistakes in front of the team. Some learned something, but others chose a different path. They didn't fix themselves. They tried to rewrite the story. Naomi adjusted her seating position, concealing her vigilance. She opened her tablet, pretending to read a report, but in reality it was to create an excuse to observe through the screen's reflection. Linda Whitmore was standing in the front galley area. She was speaking softly to a young flight attendant. Naomi couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could clearly see Linda's tense expression. Her lips pressed together, then relaxed, as if she were carefully considering each word. A moment later, Linda turned around and pulled out her personal phone. She glanced around quickly, then bowed her head and typed a few lines. Naomi frowned slightly. Flight attendants are generally not permitted to use personal phones during working hours except in emergencies. But emergency is a very flexible concept. Naomi didn't jump to conclusions. She simply memorized it. The man in the hoodie behind them was now holding a small device in his hand. Not a phone, a portable recording device. He pretended to adjust his headphones, but Naomi saw a small light flashing. Another piece fell into place. Naomi didn't turn around. She didn't want to send any signal. But she was beginning to understand that this story was being recorded in many different ways. She thought about the media, about social media, about how a short video without full context could shape the perceptions of millions of people in just a few hours. She also thought of something else. Who will be in control of this narrative? Naomi dislikes being passive, not because she needs to control everything, but because she understands very well the consequences of letting others tell her story. Linda Whitmore turned back down the aisle and continued serving. As she passed Naomi's seat, she paused briefly, then continued walking. No eye contact, no words. But Naomi realized that she is avoiding dialogue. Naomi closed her tablet and placed her hands on the folding table. She looked straight ahead, but her mind wandered. It's not over yet, she thought. It's just taken on a different form. She wondered what she should do. Reacting too quickly can unnecessarily escalate things. But complete silence can also be a mistake. Naomi learned that sometimes the best preparation isn't to act immediately, but to be ready when action becomes necessary. She took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. The plane continued to fly in a state of apparent calm, but somewhere between the first-class cabin and the galley ahead, between the averted glances and the quiet messages, another story was being written. And Naomi Carter knows this very well. When someone feels their power is threatened, they rarely stop. They will find a way to regain it by any means they deem necessary. Linda Whitmore never imagined her career would take this turn. She stood in the front galley holding an empty plastic tray, but her eyes weren't focused on her work. Her movements were precise, following the exact sequence she'd been trained in for over 2 decades. But inwardly, she was completely different. Something has gone wrong. The public apology still echoed in her mind. Not the words themselves, but the feeling of saying them. The feeling of being watched, being judged, being forced to admit something she had tried not to name for years. I was wrong. Linda swallowed hard as she thought about that remark. She was used to controlling this space. First class was her territory. She decided who got served first, who needed a reminder, who met her perceived standards. She called it experience, professional instinct. She never called it prejudice. Linda set the tray down, turning her back to the compartment as if she needed a wall to shield herself and regain her breath. She pulled out her personal phone again, her hand trembling slightly. She knew she shouldn't use it. But sometimes rules become very weak in the face of fear. Linda opened the messaging app and scrolled through her contact list. A few familiar names. Former colleagues, a regional manager who once owed her a favor, a friend who worked in the flight attendants union. She stopped at one name, Mark Ellison. Mark used to be a senior supervisor at North Atlantic Airways. He's no longer with the airline, but he still has extensive connections. And more importantly, he hates changes imposed from above. Linda typed a message, then deleted it. Typed it again, deleted it again. Finally, she sent a very short message. Need advice. Urgent. She locked the screen and put the phone in her pocket as if that could quiet the thoughts in her head. Linda returned to first class. Naomi Carter remained seated in seat 1A, calm, doing nothing special, not speaking, not requesting any additional services. It was precisely that calmness that irritated Linda. She had hoped Naomi would show anger, or at least a sense of satisfaction. Some kind of emotional reaction that Linda could cling to tell herself that she was just human, no different from herself. But Naomi didn't do that, and that made Linda feel like she was the one who was insignificant. Linda turned away, continuing to serve other passengers. She overheard fragmented conversations. Did you hear that announcement earlier? That was uncomfortable. I guess things aren't always what they seem. Each word is like a tiny needle. Linda told herself that it would all be over, that the flight would land, that tomorrow everything would be back to normal. But another voice, colder, more real, whispered in her head, "This won't end here." She thought about incident reports, about emails from management, about questions about retraining, behavioral evaluation, new procedures. She had seen others fall into that trap before, people who thought an apology would suffice. Linda didn't want to be an example. She returned to the galley this time, closing the curtains slightly to create some privacy. Her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. Message from Mark Ellison. "Call me." Linda hesitated for a second, then picked up the phone and stepped back further into the galley. "Mark," she said, lowering her voice. Mark's voice was low and slow. "I heard there was a bit of trouble on your flight." Linda closed her eyes. "You're a quick listener. Bad news always spreads quickly," Mark said, "especially when it involves very special people." Linda bit her lip. "I apologized," she said. "Publicly. Apologizing is one thing," Mark replied, "but who is telling this story is what really matters." Linda remained silent. Mark continued. "If the media found out, they wouldn't care about the context. They'd care about the image. A white flight attendant, a black CEO, a flight being delayed. You understand what I mean." Linda felt her throat dry up. "What do you want me to do?" Mark lowered his voice. "You need to protect yourself. Before others, define who you are." Linda leaned against the galley wall. How Mark was silent for a second. "By proactively reporting it," he said, "the way you want. You need to create a record showing that you handled a disruptive passenger and everything after that was a misunderstanding due to pressure." Linda opened her eyes. "Naomi Carter is not causing trouble." Mark chuckled softly, but there was no hint of joy in his smile. "Nobody said that," he said. "Just show that you believe there's a risk. Flight safety is the top priority. You just need to sow a seed of doubt." Linda clutched the phone tightly. "You're saying I'm lying." "I'm telling you to survive," Mark replied. 25 years of your career. Do you want it to end in a spliced video online?" Linda closed her eyes again. Images flashed through her mind. The cockpit. First class. Naomi Carter's gaze when she admitted I was wrong. Part of her wanted to stop, to accept the consequences. But another, larger, more fearful part wouldn't. She built her life around doing what was right. She couldn't bear the thought of being remembered as someone who was wrong. "I'll think about it," Linda said. "She doesn't have much time," Mark replied. "Once the plane lands, everything will begin. The call has ended." Linda stood still in the galley, feeling as if the airplane floor was tilting slightly. Not from turbulence, but from the very thoughts she was contemplating. She opened the curtain and stepped out into the compartment. Naomi Carter was still there, calm, as if completely unaware that just a few feet ahead another story was being written in parallel. Linda looked at Naomi one more time. This time her gaze was no longer merely evasive, it was one of quiet calculation. In the back seat, the man in the gray hoodie remained seated. He tilted his head as if listening not only to the sounds in his headphones, but also to the slightest movements of the people around him. Everything still looks normal. But beneath that apparent normalcy, a conspiracy had begun to take shape. And once it's activated, no one on this flight will be able to pretend that it's all over. The man in the gray hoodie wasn't the type to draw attention to himself. He sat in the back row of first-class seats next to the aisle, thin and slightly hunched, like someone more accustomed to observing than to making an impression. Since takeoff, he had barely moved. No drinks, no movies, no sleep, just listen. Naomi Carter sensed its presence early on, but she didn't reveal it. Experience taught her that sometimes safety comes from pretending not to notice what's happening around you. When Linda Whitmore pulled out her phone in the galley, Naomi saw it. When the man adjusted the recording device in his sleeve, Naomi saw that too. But she waited. She always waits until all the pieces naturally fall into place. About an hour after the plane had steadied, Naomi stood up and walked slowly toward the restroom ahead. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't give the impression she was looking for anyone. It was just a perfectly normal action on a long flight. When she emerged from the restroom, the man in the gray hoodie was already standing nearby, as if he were just waiting for his turn. "Miss Carter," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. Naomi stopped and turned to look at him. "Yes, I think we should talk," he said, "if you have a few minutes." Naomi looked at him for a second, not to judge his appearance but to sense his sincerity. His eyes held no feigned urgency, only the focused intensity of someone accustomed to keeping secrets. "Now," she asked. He nodded slightly. "Before things get more complicated." Naomi thought quickly. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask why. She just nodded. "Okay." They huddled in a small corner near the compartment door where the engine noise masked most of the surrounding sounds. "My name is Ethan Brooks," the man said. "I'm an investigative journalist." Naomi didn't seem surprised. She just nodded. "I guess so." Ethan smiled faintly. The smile was brief, almost a professional reflex. "I documented most of what happened," he continued. "From the moment she was asked to leave the plane to the public apology." Naomi looked straight at him. "And what do you want?" Ethan tilted his head, lowering his voice even further. "I'm not here to chase sensational news," he said. "I've been following North Atlantic Airways for several months now. There are internal cultural issues. When this happened, I knew I couldn't ignore it." Naomi remained silent. Ethan opened his phone but didn't turn on the screen. He just held it in his hand as if to confirm that he had the evidence, but wasn't in a hurry to show it. "I also overheard part of the call in the galley," he said. "I don't know the whole thing, but it's enough to know that this story might be distorted upon landing." Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. "Linda Whitmore," she said. Ethan nodded. "She's trying to rewrite the story," he said, "in a way that's favorable to her." Naomi inhaled slowly. "You know who I am," she said. Ethan looked at her, his gaze serious. "I know," he replied, "but what I care about isn't her title. It's the truth." Naomi looked towards the front of the cabin. Linda Whitmore was standing and talking to another flight attendant. She smiled slightly, but her eyes didn't. "What are you planning to do?" Naomi asked. Ethan thought for a second. "I want to ask you first," he said. "How would you like this story told?" That question made Naomi pause. Very few people ever asked her this. Usually they decided for her. "I don't want a witch hunt," Naomi said slowly. "I don't want anyone ruined just to satisfy the anger of the crowd." Ethan nodded. "Then we're the same," he said. "I want the system to respond, not just an individual." Naomi looked at him for a longer time. "Do you have enough evidence?" she asked. Ethan gently lifted the small bag at his side. "Video," he said. "Audio, and some messages that I believe will be very difficult to interpret." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't like having to rely on the media. But she also understood that in this world the truth isn't automatically heard. It needs to be protected. "Once we land," Naomi said, "everything will go very quickly." Ethan nodded. "Airport police might be called," he said. "Not because of you, but because of a security report." Naomi opened her eyes. "Which report?" Ethan looked straight at her. A report stated that there was a disruptive passenger whose behavior threatened the safety of the flight. Naomi didn't need to ask any further questions. She knew who the report would be aimed at. "What can you do?" she asked. "I can testify," Ethan said. "And if necessary, I will release everything I recorded." Naomi thought, very quickly but very deeply. She thought about letting things blow over, thought about handling it internally after landing, thought about avoiding further commotion. Then she thought of others, those who didn't have her place, those who would continue to be doubted, pushed out of the space they deserved. "Wait," Naomi said. "Don't announce anything until I tell you." Ethan nodded. "I'm here," he said, "not to lead the story, but to protect it." Naomi returned to her seat. She sat down, fastened her seatbelt, and looked straight ahead. But inside, she felt something very clearly. She is no longer alone. And if anyone is trying to portray her as a troublemaker this time, they'll have to face the full documented truth from beginning to end. At the front of the compartment, Linda Whitmore glanced quickly at Naomi. Her gaze lingered a little longer than before, as if she sensed something had changed, though she couldn't quite put a name to it. Naomi looked back very calmly. She didn't smile. She just waited. The plane began to descend. The change didn't come suddenly, but very slowly, very evenly. Small vibrations spread through the aircraft. The seatbelt sign lit up. A few passengers stopped what they were doing, looking up with the familiar reflex of those who had flown enough to recognize this moment. Naomi Carter placed her hand on the seatbelt, gently pulling to ensure it was properly fastened. That familiar movement gave her a very real, very lifelike feeling, like a small anchor point amidst a series of events unfolding faster than expected. She looked out the window. Below, the ground gradually came into view. Patches of greenery, roads, buildings. Everything looked so normal that it was almost unbelievable that in just a few minutes, everything could take a completely different turn. At the front of the cabin, Linda Whitmore was walking along the aisle, reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts and adjusting their seats. She worked with intense concentration, as if focusing on every small detail to avoid thinking about the bigger picture that awaited her below. But Naomi noticed a very subtle change. Linda's pace slowed. Her eyes frequently glanced forward in the compartment, then turned away. She didn't look Naomi directly, but she couldn't completely avoid her gaze either. Naomi didn't look at her for long. She didn't want to provoke a fight. She was simply taking note. In the back seat, Ethan Brooks sat up straighter. His gray hoodie was pulled down a little lower, not to hide, but to blend in with the crowd. He said nothing to Naomi, but when their eyes met for a very brief moment, Naomi recognized the familiar wariness of someone about to enter a tense situation. The loudspeaker blared. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent." Captain Michael Reynolds' voice was even and clear. "Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Naomi inhaled slowly. She wasn't afraid, but she also had no illusions that everything would go smoothly. She recalled what Ethan had said, a security report. In Naomi's mind, possible scenarios unfolded. Airport police were often called for a variety of reasons: a drunk passenger, an argument, some vague suspicion disguised as flight safety. She understood very well how reports like that could be written. Just a few words are enough to be vague. Disruptive behavior, refusal to comply, potential threat. No immediate, clear evidence is needed. Just sow the seeds of doubt. The rest will be handled by the system. Naomi looked down at her hands, still holding strong. But this time, that resilience didn't come from her habit of enduring hardship. It came from her preparation. The plane touched down on the runway with a slight tremor. A few scattered claps came from the rear cabin, typical of passengers who like to mark a smooth landing. Naomi didn't applaud. She just looked straight ahead. The plane slowed down, then turned onto the taxiway. Through the window, Naomi saw the terminal building come into view. Large glass doors, ground vehicles moving, and then she saw them. 2 airport police officers stood near the gate, right where the jet bridge would connect. They stood next to an airline security officer. They stood upright, hands at their sides. They weren't in a hurry, nor were they overly tense, but their presence was enough. Naomi felt her heart rate slow down, not out of fear, but because of a chilling clarity. They called the police. In first class, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. Several passengers also witnessed the scene. Eyes began to exchange glances. Whispers arose softly. "Why are the cops there? Is everything okay? Did something happen?" Linda Whitmore stood in the aisle, staring out through the small window near the airplane door. Her face was rigid. She swallowed hard. Naomi realized that even though Linda had prepared herself mentally, this moment still terrified her. The airplane door opened. A blast of cold air filled the cabin. A ground staff member appeared and exchanged a brief word with Linda. Naomi couldn't hear clearly, but saw Linda nod very quickly. Then Linda came back. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, trying to maintain a calm tone, "please remain seated for a moment after arrival." That statement in this context is not meant to be reassuring. It means waiting. 2 police officers boarded the plane. Their footsteps echoed louder than any other sound. They walked straight ahead without looking around. They showed no aggression, but their concentration made the entire first-class cabin hold its breath. Naomi sat up straight. She didn't stand up. She didn't flinch. She didn't make any movement that could be misinterpreted. An officer stopped near seat 1A. "Ma'am," he said, his voice neutral, "may we speak with you for a moment?" In that moment, time seemed to slow down. Some passengers lowered their heads. Others looked at Naomi, their eyes a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. No one said anything. Naomi nodded. Of course. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Her movements were slow and deliberate. She didn't want anyone to be able to say that she was abrupt or uncooperative. "Is there a problem?" Naomi asked. The officer glanced at the small sign in his hand. "We received a report," he said, "about an incident on board." Naomi didn't seem surprised. A report from whom, she asked. The officer hesitated slightly. From a member of the cabin crew. Linda Whitmore stood a few feet away. She stared intently at the airplane floor. Her hands were clasped together, her knuckles turning white. Naomi looked at her for a very brief second. Then she turned back to look at the officer. "I'm willing to cooperate," Naomi said, "but I want to make it clear that every interaction I had on this flight was witnessed." The officer nodded, showing no sign of doubt. "Ma'am," he said, "we'd like you to step off the aircraft." The words rang out exactly the same as the ones Naomi had heard just hours earlier. A terrifying loop. Ethan Brooks stood up in the back seat. "Officer," he said, his voice clear before she goes anywhere, "I need to state that I witnessed the entire incident." The officer turned around slightly surprised. "Sir, please remain seated." Ethan didn't sit down. "My name is Ethan Brooks," he said. "I'm an investigative journalist, and I have recorded evidence of what happened on this flight." The first-class cabin fell into absolute silence. Naomi looked straight ahead. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. But in her heart, something very clear had formed. This climax is not the end. It's just a gateway to the truth. The first-class compartment froze solid. It wasn't out of fear, but because everyone realized one thing very clearly: things had just crossed the line into a flight incident. Ethan Brooks stood tall, his hand still holding the phone. He didn't raise it. He didn't make any defiant gestures. He just stood there very calmly, like someone accustomed to the truth speaking for himself. "Sir," the officer said, his voice still polite, "we'll speak with you shortly." "For now, please, I understand," Ethan interrupted, not raising his voice. "But I need to make one thing clear. The security report that was just submitted doesn't accurately reflect what happened." The officer looked at him more closely. "And you're saying you have proof?" Ethan nodded. "Video, audio, from multiple perspectives, continuously from the moment Miss Carter was first questioned until her public apology." A long silence followed. Naomi Carter stood beside seat 1A. She didn't push her way through. There was no need to. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, but her ears were listening for the slightest changes in the voices of those around her. The officer turned to Naomi. "Ma'am," he said, "would you be willing to wait here while we review this?" Naomi nodded. Of course. Linda Whitmore stood not far away. Her face was noticeably pale. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then stopped. Her hands trembled slightly. Officer Linda said, finally, her voice cracking slightly, "This is unnecessary. I already addressed the situation on board." The officer turned to her. "Ma'am," he said, "we need to review all available information." Linda took half a step back. Ethan opened his phone and tapped the screen a few times. He didn't play the video for everyone in the cabin to see. He handed the device to the officer. "Please," he said, "start from the beginning." The officer wore headphones and looked at the screen. His colleague stood beside him, bending down to watch with him. The image appeared very clear on the small screen. Naomi Carter seated in seat 1A. Linda Whitmore stands beside her, requesting a second ticket check. Her voice is polite, but her eyes are different. The video continues. "A question about the membership program. An insinuation about passengers who fit into this cabin." The sound is clear. No cuts or splicing. The officer frowned. "The video cuts." 2 security officers are called. Naomi stands up, cooperates, and remains silent. There are no aggressive gestures. She doesn't refuse any requests. Another passage. A public apology. delivered via internal loudspeakers. Linda admitted to assume Naomi didn't belong in that seat. At that moment, the officer removed one of his earphones and looked up. "Ma'am," he said to Linda, "you made this announcement." Linda didn't answer immediately. "Yes," she said softly. The officer turned back to the screen. The final video was played. A short but very clear audio recording. Linda Whitmore's voice in the galley was low but audible. "If we frame it as a safety concern, they'll have to take it seriously." A deathly silence descended upon the first-class cabin. The officer paused the video. He looked at Linda for a long time. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "did you file a report stating that Miss Carter posed a safety threat?" Linda opened her mouth. No sound came out. Naomi looked at her, not angry, not defiant, just a very sad look. Linda swallowed hard. "I was under pressure," she said. "Everything escalated so quickly." The officer shook his head. "Pressure doesn't justify false reporting," he said. He turned to Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said, "based on what we've seen so far, you are not required to leave this aircraft." Naomi nodded. "Thank you," she said. "That's all." The officer turned back towards Linda. "Ma'am," he said, "I need you to step off the aircraft with us." Linda stepped back. "Officer," she said, her voice trembling, "this is a misunderstanding." Ethan spoke very softly. "No," he said, "it isn't." Linda turned to him, her eyes suddenly filled with fear. "You don't understand," she said. "You don't live within this system." Ethan looked at her, his voice unchanged. "I understand perfectly," he said, "and that's why I'm here." The two officers took a step forward, not hurried, not rough. "Ma'am," the officer said, "please cooperate." Linda looked around the first-class cabin. The glances were no longer evasive, no longer confused. Only the heavy silence of those who had just witnessed an undeniable truth remained. She looked at Naomi. There was so much in those eyes, regret, anger, and a very deep fear. Naomi said nothing. Linda turned away. She walked out into the hallway, followed by the two officers. Each step she took was heavier than the last. As the airplane door closed behind them, something very clear had just come to an end. The officer returned to the compartment. "Thank you for your patience," he said. "We apologize for the inconvenience." No one applauded, no one cheered, but many people breathed a sigh of relief. Naomi sat down in seat 1A. Her back rested against the leather seat. She closed her eyes for a very brief moment. "It's not because I'm tired," because she needed a moment to process what had just happened. Ethan Brooks returned to his seat. Before sitting down, he looked at Naomi. "Thank you for trusting me," he said. Naomi looked at him. "Thank you for stepping forward," she replied. In the cockpit, Captain Michael Reynolds received a brief announcement from the ground. He removed his headset and leaned back in his seat. Finally, he thought the system had been forced to listen. The first-class cabin gradually returned to normal. But none of them would forget this moment. Naomi opened her eyes and looked straight ahead. She knew this wasn't the end. But the truth is, once it's placed on the table, it's not easily taken away. No one said anything as Linda Whitmore disembarked from the plane. The door closed behind her very softly, but the sound resonated in many people's minds like a final punctuation mark. There was no shouting, no commentary. Just a long, heavy silence, as if the first-class cabin had just experienced a shockwave, and no one knew how to react properly. Naomi Carter sat in seat 1A, her hands resting on the armrest. She didn't look at Linda. She didn't look down, either. She just stared straight ahead, where the aisle had been more empty just seconds before. She didn't feel victorious. The only feeling that permeated her at this moment was profound weariness, the kind of weariness that only comes after something that has lasted too long finally has to stop. Another flight attendant, younger, approached the front of the cabin. Naomi had never met this girl before. She stopped next to seat 1, bowing slightly. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice quiet on behalf of the crew. "I'm very sorry for what you experienced today." Naomi looked at the girl, her gaze softening. "Thank you," Naomi said. "I know this isn't easy for anyone." The girl nodded clearly, relieved not to be reprimanded. She stepped back and continued with her work. First class gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. But one thing had changed forever: the way people saw Naomi, and perhaps the way they saw the very system they once believed in. In the back, Ethan Brooks sat down in his seat and took off his headphones. He didn't open his phone. He didn't send a text message. He didn't update anything online. He just sat there watching. He's been in this profession long enough to know the most important stories don't need to be rushed. In the cockpit, Captain Michael Reynolds received a call from the airline's control center. He listened for a long time without interrupting. When the call ended, he put down his headset and leaned back in his seat. Daniel Price, the co-pilot, looked at him. "They're opening a formal investigation," Daniel said. Reynolds nodded. "Good," he replied. "That's how it should be." Daniel was silent for a moment, then asked, "Do you think this will go beyond the flight?" Reynolds looked straight ahead. "It already has," he said. "They just don't know it yet." At the train station, Linda Whitmore sat on a metal chair, her hands clasped together. The police had left, having completed their initial statement. She wasn't handcuffed. She wasn't being led away like a criminal. But that relief offered no comfort. A security guard placed a piece of paper in front of her. "This is a temporary suspension notice," he said. "HR will be in touch." Linda looked at the paper. The black and white writing looked eerily lifeless. "Temporary," she repeated. The employee did not answer. Linda folded the paper carefully as if it were a habit left over from the days when she was in control, but her hands trembled. This time she couldn't hide it. Images flashed through her mind. First class, Naomi Carter's gaze, the public apology, the galley recording. She realized something she had never dared to confront before. Naomi didn't take away her power. She herself laid it on a foundation that was flawed a long time ago. On the plane, Naomi Carter closed her eyes for a few seconds. Not to sleep, just to breathe. She thought of other black women. Women who didn't have cameras. Women who didn't have journalists sitting behind them. Women who weren't in a position to force the system to listen. She thought of the stories that had been suppressed before they could be fully told. A flight attendant brought Naomi a cup of hot tea. "Complimentary," she said. "From the captain." Naomi smiled very slightly. "Thank you," she said. She held the teacup, feeling the warmth spread into her palm. A small, everyday sensation, but enough to bring her back to the present. Ethan Brooks stood up and stepped forward. "Miss Carter," he said softly, "when we land completely and disembark, things might get complicated." Naomi nodded. "I know. Reporters may be waiting," Ethan said. "Statements will be requested." Naomi looked at him. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Ethan thought for a moment. "I'll do what I always do," he said. "Verify. Write it correctly. No additions, no subtractions." Naomi nodded. "That's enough." A brief silence fell between them. No further words were needed. In first class, a passenger stood up and walked towards Naomi. It was the man who had been sitting in seat 1B. "Miss Carter," he said, slightly hesitant, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not speaking up earlier." Naomi looked at him, her eyes devoid of reproach. "Not everyone is ready to speak up in that moment," she said. "I understand." The man nodded, clearly relieved. The plane continued moving toward its final parking area. The engine noise gradually died down. A chapter had closed, but its consequences were only just beginning to unfold. Naomi looked out the window. She didn't know exactly what awaited her. Meetings, urgent calls, the media, the board of directors, difficult decisions. But there's one thing she knows very well. This story will not be resolved through emotions. It will be resolved through accountability. And this time, responsibility can no longer be pushed aside. The plane finally came to a complete stop. The engine noise faded, leaving behind a quiet space very different from the silence in the air. This was the quiet of the ground of decisions no longer delayed by altitude or flight time. The airplane door opened. The air from the terminal rushed in, carrying the familiar scent of coffee metal and hurried footsteps. Passengers began to stand up, retrieve their luggage, and line up to depart. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But Naomi Carter knew that from this moment on, nothing was normal anymore. She was the last to stand up. It wasn't because she wanted to draw attention. Rather, she needed a few extra seconds to compose herself. She adjusted her blazer, picked up her handbag, and took a slow, deep breath. Ethan Brooks stood in the hallway waiting for her. "Ready?" he asked softly. Naomi nodded. "I was never completely ready," she said, "but I'm okay." They disembarked from the plane. The moment Naomi's foot touched the jet bridge, she heard a commotion coming from the station ahead. Not shouting, but an organized uproar. Walkie-talkies, rushing footsteps. Someone calling her name indistinct but recognizable. As they entered the station, the scene unfolded very quickly. A group of reporters stood behind a makeshift barrier. Cameras were on. Spotlights were pointed directly at the exit. Several people raised microphones and shouted, "Miss Carter!" Naomi Carter, do you have a comment? Is it true you were removed from first class? Naomi stopped. She wasn't surprised. She knew this would happen. But knowing and facing it are two very different things. Ethan stood beside her, leaning slightly, creating a small barrier but enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. We don't need to answer right away, he said. Naomi looked toward the reporters. The lights were a little blinding, but they didn't faze her. 5 minutes, she said. I'll say 5 minutes. Ethan nodded. Naomi took a step forward, just enough for the microphone to pick up her voice. Good afternoon, she said. Her voice was low, not shaky. My name is Naomi Carter. Just a simple sentence, but it instantly brought a sense of calm to the room. I just went through a situation that no passenger should have to go through, Naomi continued. And I believe this story isn't just about me. A reporter pushed his way to the front. Miss Carter, were you discriminated against because of your race? Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked directly at the person who had asked the question. I was judged based on an assumption, she said. And that assumption wasn't based on my behavior, but on what I looked like. She paused for a moment. You can call it whatever you want, but I call it a systemic problem. A wave of murmurs spread. Another reporter asked loudly, Are you planning to sue the airline? Naomi shook her head. I haven't made that decision yet, she said. What I'm concerned about right now isn't litigation, it's responsibility. She looked directly into the camera. North Atlantic Airways has an opportunity to review how they train, supervise, and protect their passengers. I hope they will take advantage of that opportunity. There were no threats, no harsh statements, but every word Naomi said carried weight. Ethan stepped forward, raising his hand slightly. That's all for now, he said. Thank you. They turned away, leaving behind the calls that continued to echo. In a private airport lounge, Naomi sat down on a sofa, relaxing her shoulders. The room was quiet, completely isolated from the chaos outside. She felt tired, not physically tired, but a kind of weariness that had accumulated from constantly having to stay alert and on guard. Ethan sat opposite, opening his laptop. You did a great job, he said. Naomi smiled very slightly. I'm just telling the truth, she replied. Naomi's phone vibrated. One message, then another, then more. Company executives, partners, friends, family. She didn't open it right away. She placed the phone face down on the table. Not the right time, she said, as if talking to herself. Ethan looked at her. Do you know what will happen next? He asked. Naomi thought for a moment. An internal investigation, she said. A hearing, memos, carefully written apologies. Ethan nodded. And the pressure, he said. Not everyone likes it when the system is under scrutiny. Naomi looked at him. I've lived with pressure my whole life, she said. The difference is, this time I don't have to carry it alone. Elsewhere in the city, Mark Ellison sat in front of his computer screen reviewing the video that was beginning to spread online. He turned off the screen and let out a long sigh. At North Atlantic Airways headquarters, an emergency meeting was convened. Faces were tense. Difficult questions were being asked. Decisions could not be delayed any longer. At the terminal, Linda Whitmore left the airport through a side exit unaccompanied. She walked quickly with her head down, not out of embarrassment in front of the crowd, but because she didn't know how she would face herself from tomorrow onwards. Naomi Carter stood up in the waiting room. She looked out the large glass window where the stream of people continued to move. Life didn't stop, but it had shifted slightly in a different direction. She picked up her phone and opened the first message. It was from her mother. Are you okay? Naomi typed a reply. I'm fine. And I'm not silent. She put away her phone and turned to Ethan. This story, she said, will go far beyond that flight. Ethan nodded. And it won't just be her story, he said. Naomi inhaled and exhaled. The aftershocks are still spreading, but she stood firm at the epicenter. And this time she had no intention of leaving. The small meeting room in the hotel near the airport was so quiet that Naomi Carter could hear the steady hum of the air conditioner on the ceiling. Outside the window, the city continues to move. Cars, people passing by, appointments following one another. Life flows at its own pace, waiting for no one. But inside this room, Naomi was standing at a crossroads she knew very well if she chose wrong, the consequences would not be limited to just herself. Naomi sat at the head of the table. In front of her was a thin stack of documents, not a contract, not a financial report, but a proposal, Independent Review and Equity Reform Initiative, North Atlantic Airways. Ethan Brooks sat opposite him, his laptop open but the screen off. He said nothing. He had learned that there were moments when silent presence was most necessary. Naomi turned the pages one by one. The lettering was meticulously crafted. The language was neutral. The legal terms were carefully chosen. A formal invitation from the management of North Atlantic Airways, not to apologize again, but to ask her to participate in the process of independent review and internal cultural reform, an advisory position. Unpaid. No heavy legal obligations. But it's highly symbolic. Naomi put the documents down. She felt neither angry nor proud. She just felt a heavy weight. "You're not obligated to accept," Ethan said, his voice low. "No one has the right to demand this from you." Naomi nodded. "I know." She stood up and walked to the window. The afternoon sunlight shone on her face, highlighting her experienced features rather than her weariness. Naomi considered a different path. She could have absolutely refused. She could have focused on her company. She could have let her lawyers handle everything. She could have turned this story into a clean, personal victory. Many people would support that choice. But then she thought of something else. She thought of the moment she stood on the conduit bridge alone between two spaces belonging to neither. She thought of the feeling of being suspected without proof. She thought of Linda Whitmore's gaze when she said, "I believed you might not belong in that seat." Naomi no longer thinks of Linda as an individual. She thought about the system that had allowed that idea to exist for so long without being challenged. "Do you know what worries me the most?" Naomi said without turning around. Ethan shook his head. "It's not that I was treated unfairly," Naomi said. "It's that people viewed it as something that could happen." She turned around and looked at Ethan. "If I refuse," she said, "everything will still go on. Maybe more subtly, maybe more quietly. But it won't disappear." Ethan looked at her for a long time. "And if you accept," he said, "you'll be scrutinized, criticized. Some people will say you're helping them whitewash their image." Naomi smiled very slightly. "I'm used to being misunderstood," she said, "but I'm not used to knowing I can do something and then not doing it." She returned to the table, picking up the documents once more. Her hands didn't tremble, but her heart beat slowly and deeply as it always did when she was about to make a decision with no turning back. Naomi recalled a very old conversation with her first teacher. He once said, "Leadership isn't about everyone applauding. Leadership is when no one is sure you're doing it right, not even you." Naomi placed the documents down neatly. "I'll accept," she said. Ethan didn't seem surprised, but he let out a slow sigh as if confirming something he'd long suspected. "Provided," Naomi continued. Ethan looked up. "I don't endorse any media campaigns," Naomi said. "I don't appear in promotional videos, and I don't stay silent if I see something wrong." She looked directly at Ethan as if he were the embodiment of the outside world. "I want the right to say no," she said, "and the right to leave if they don't genuinely want to change." Ethan nodded. "I'll take note of that," he said. "And if they don't keep their word, the story will continue." Naomi nodded slightly. "That's enough." Naomi's phone rang. It was a call from her company's board of directors. She looked at the screen for a few seconds, then silenced it. "Not now," she said. Ethan smiled. "She's choosing a more difficult path," he said. Naomi looked out the window. "Easy paths," she said, "rarely lead to where you need to go." Evening fell quickly. The city lights came on each small patch of light, like a separate story following one another, but not merging into one. Naomi sat back down at the table and took out her pen. She signed her name on the last page of the proposal. Her signature was neat, unpretentious, but decisive. She put down her pen. There was no applause, no background music, no cinematic moment at all. It's just a decision. But Naomi knew that decisions like these were what truly changed the course of things. Ethan stood up. "I'll get back to them," he said, "and I'll be following this process closely." Naomi nodded. "I don't expect everything to go smoothly," she said, "but I hope it will be honest." When Ethan left, Naomi was left alone in the room. She sat down, allowing herself to completely relax for the first time that day. She thought about tomorrow, about the difficult meetings, about the suspicious glances, about the questions that wouldn't always have clear answers. But she also thought of something else. To those who will no longer have to stand alone on the pipeline bridge. To first-class cabins or any space where their presence will no longer be questioned simply because they look different. Naomi Carter closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She made her choice. And this time, she didn't choose for herself. The morning arrived slowly and gently. Sunlight streamed through the hotel room, curtains falling onto the small table where Naomi Carter had left the documents the night before. Her signature was still there, the ink dried, the strokes decisive but unpretentious. A very quiet milestone without fanfare. Naomi woke up earlier than usual. She sat up, placing her feet on the floor, feeling the subtle coolness of the ground. A very real, very earthly sensation, like a reminder that everything continues one step at a time. She brewed coffee and stood by the window watching the city awaken. The traffic began to pick up. People going to work, people jogging, separate stories unknown to each other, yet all coexisting in a shared space. Naomi thought about yesterday's flight. It wasn't the moment she was asked to leave her seat. It wasn't the moment the police boarded the plane. It was that very brief moment when she stood on the bridge between two spaces and realized she could never return to her old self. He was someone who remained silent to maintain peace. He was someone who accepted being suspected so that things would just blow over. That person stayed behind. The phone vibrated, a text message from Ethan Brooks. The airline issued a statement this morning. No spin, just facts. It's different. Naomi smiled very slightly. Thank you, she replied. And thank you for not rushing. She put down the phone and took a sip of coffee, the familiar bitterness but pleasant. After breakfast, Naomi went to North Atlantic Airways' temporary headquarters for her first meeting with the independent review team. No cameras, no press. Just a simple meeting room, a few tense but attentive faces. Naomi doesn't talk much. She didn't recount the story in a way that would embarrass others. She only described very specific moments, the feeling of being suspected, the silence of those around her, and how a small assumption could lead to a chain of major decisions. The most dangerous thing, Naomi said calmly, is not the people who deliberately discriminate. It's the people who believe they're just following the proper procedure. The room was silent. It's not because no one understands. It's because everyone understands. The meeting ended without flowery promises. No grand pronouncements. Just recorded questions and a list of tasks. Very slow, but very real. In the afternoon, Naomi left the building, taking a short walk before getting into her car. She wanted to feel the air. She wanted to hear the sounds of the city. She wanted to remind herself that big changes always begin with very small steps. Elsewhere in the city, Linda Whitmore sat in her quiet apartment. No uniform, no flight schedule, no familiar interphone calls. She stared at the suspension notice on her desk for a long time. Linda was no longer angry with Naomi Carter. That feeling was gone. Instead, there was an emptiness that was hard to name. For the first time in years, she didn't know who she was when she was out of control. She recalled Naomi's gaze when she said, "I just need to be treated fairly." That statement doesn't accuse, but it also doesn't allow for evasion. Linda closed her eyes. Some changes come late, but late doesn't mean meaningless. At Naomi's company headquarters, the board of directors held an emergency meeting. Numbers, risks, media proposals. Naomi listened but didn't let herself get carried away. "We don't need to exploit this story," she said. "We need to learn from it." Some nodded. Some hesitated, but no one objected. That evening, Naomi returned home. A familiar apartment, warm lighting, old photographs hanging on the walls. A very ordinary life, but one built over many years of unseen effort. She called her mother. "I'm fine," Naomi said before her mother could ask. On the other end of the line, a soft sigh was heard. "I know," her voice was gentle. "I've always known." Naomi smiled. "I have chosen the difficult path," she said. "I know," she repeated. "But you didn't choose it alone." After the call, Naomi sat down on the sofa and opened her laptop. She didn't read the news. She didn't check social media. Instead, she wrote, "Not a speech, not a manifesto, just a few notes for myself. Remember what it feels like to stand alone. Remember why you weren't silent. Remember that change doesn't have to be loud to be real." The next day, an email arrived from a young employee of North Atlantic Airways. It wasn't signed in full, just a small name. "Miss Carter, I just wanted to say thank you. I've never seen anyone handle something like that with so much calm. It made me feel like maybe things can change." Naomi took a long time to read that email. Then she answered, "Thank you for writing. And remember, you deserve to be wherever you've worked to get to." She closed her laptop. Outside the window, the city lights came on. People continued to move. Flights continued to take off and land. Life went on. But somewhere very quietly something has shifted. Not because of a winner, not because of a punished person, because the truth has been spoken and it cannot be retracted. Naomi Carter stood up and walked to the window. She looked at the night sky where the airplanes left thin streaks of light before fading away. She doesn't know what the future holds. Nobody knows. But she knew one thing. Next time a black woman walks into first class, or any other space for that matter, the question, does she belong here, will be a little harder to utter. And sometimes hope doesn't have to be a blinding light. Just a small change is enough to ensure that others don't have to stand alone like she once did. This story isn't just about discrimination. It's about human dignity, something that is sometimes challenged in the smallest, most ordinary moments of life. Naomi Carter didn't win through anger. She didn't yell. She didn't make a fuss. She won by not doubting her own worth, even when the entire system around her did. The biggest lesson here is, you are not obligated to prove that you deserve what you have accomplished. In life, especially as we get older, many people choose silence to maintain peace. They choose to compromise so that things will pass. But this story reminds us that prolonged silence is sometimes not tolerance, but rather allowing injustice to continue. Another lesson, and a very important one. Real change doesn't come from humiliating someone, but from forcing the system to examine itself. Naomi didn't choose revenge. She chose responsibility. She didn't portray herself as a victim, but neither did she portray herself as a bystander. And perhaps the most healing message is, you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stand firm and not abandon yourself. No matter your age, you deserve to be treated with respect. And it's never too late to choose what's better, for yourself and for others. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Your presence is the reason why stories of kindness continue to be told. If you see yourself somewhere in the story, please, like to show your support. Share this so that others no longer feel alone, and subscribe to the channel to continue following stories that touch upon human values. See you again in the next story.